Hey, good day, everybody. Today, Rebecca Berman is unable to join us, and so Arlene Grossman will be asking the questions that we have. And so, Arlene, please kick it off.
Okay, thank you. I'm very sorry that Rebecca's not available, but she will be back next week. Okay, I'd like to introduce Glenn Grossman. Glenn Grossman is an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience. While pursuing his doctorate in epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, Glenn served as an epidemiologist on staff at the UNC Infectious Disease Clinic for 2 years and taught epidemiology and advanced analytics at Duke Medical School and UNC. He has been involved in epidemiology projects with Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Administration, Military Health Service, CDC, and other programs in the US and outside of the US. He is currently Senior Director of Outcomes Research and Epidemiology at Novartis, but all views expressed today are his own. Okay. So, Glenn, if you could start. Okay, we have some questions this week. If anybody has questions, please send them in. We'll try to get to them this week. If not, we will definitely answer them next week. Okay. Glenn, you tell me when you're ready for me to start asking the questions that we have that came in during the week.
Okay, sure. Why don't I start first by just showing us what the latest is with the US and abroad, and just jumping in there. That might be the easiest.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, so what we're looking at here. So the United States has continued to climb, both in terms of diagnosed cases after Thanksgiving, hospitalizations, and deaths. But interestingly, when you look at this regionally, this is very surprising to a lot of us. When you look at this regionally, what you find is that actually the Midwest, which was hit really hard before even the South and the rest of us started getting hit, has sort of peaked and is now going back down, which is really interesting. And it means that the other areas of the country might actually peak earlier than we thought that they would. This is really good news. In fact, it was such good news that some of the forecasts have sort of been restated. So I'll go through them in a little while, but you can see, so the Northeast is still rising, West is still rising, and South is still rising. Nowhere near out of the woods yet, but the Midwest seems like it's going down. Now, part of this could be due to testing or other things, but it does seem that it's a real effect when you start digging into it. So for instance, what I did is I pulled out some of these graphs. So the one that we were just looking at, this is normalized per million people. And so by doing this, the one we were just looking at a little earlier, just a few seconds ago, was the totals. And so the Midwest looked a little bit lower relative to the South, for instance. But when you look at it this way, you see that the Midwest was hit much hard per capita, so within each state. But this peak, it looks like it's reached the peak and is starting to go down a little bit. So let's look into some of those specific countries that might be driving this. So for instance, when you look at some of the states, not countries, rather states. Let me bring this one to the front. So this one that we're looking at is Wisconsin. And Wisconsin, not only do they have cases that have gone down, their hospitalizations have gone down as well. And hospitalizations are likely to be much more accurate than the case rate that we're looking at. Deaths, there's always a delay, so I'm not looking at that quite as much. But the hospitalization rate, it's really interesting, start to go down. When you look at other states as well, here, let me make this one smaller. So when you look at Michigan, it's not quite as big an effect, but you can see that it's starting to go down a bit. When you look at Illinois, you can see it is a dramatic decrease. So it has reached its peak. So because when you start going on a state-by-state level, it does seem like it's a more consistent effect. So this one is Indiana. Many of these, you can see the testing has not continued going up. The testing has either gone down or has leveled off, but the caseload has dropped off despite this, and hospitalization load has gone down. Similarly, here's Ohio. So Ohio is still pretty high in hospitalizations, but it looks like it's leveling off a little bit. So this will be so based on the way the rest of the Midwest is doing, it could be that it's at its peak. We're just beginning to see Thanksgiving data in here, so it could be a sort of another mini surge that we see after Thanksgiving, and then the other holidays that are about to hit as well. We could sort of see another mini surge that comes after this. We don't really know what the data looks like yet for Thanksgiving, because we're just starting to see some of the effects. When we look at North Dakota, which was I was just looking at, I don't know where it went. Is this it? Kansas. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. So some of the states, like, so here's South Dakota that I was just looking at. Oh, here's North Dakota. So North Dakota, one thing that's I'm gonna mute everyone. All right. Actually, it sounds like it's good now. So one thing that you can see with North Dakota is that the number of tests decreased dramatically. And so it's hard to know if the cases that decreased were simply an artifact of the testing decreasing. But the fact is that we see hospitalization decreasing as well. And so this is probably a more accurate indicator. One interesting thing about the cases is that there is this spike in reporting. So it seems like some of this is a reporting issue as opposed to it's hard to makes it a little more difficult to interpret. But again, as we get more robust Thanksgiving data coming in, we should already have started to see some of this, and yet and so that could be what's explaining some of this increase in cases that were diagnosed. But the spike was most likely due to a lot of people not reporting the positive tests in that window of like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday around Thanksgiving. And so this might have just been a bunch of tests all reported all at once. So we need to see what the data looks like in the next few days, the next week. But interestingly, so when we incorporate this into the forecasts, so this is good news. Let me compare first. So this was the previous lockdown projections. So this was the November 19th was from roughly a month ago, a little bit less than a month ago. This was the lockdown projections of what would be expected to happen in November and December. Very few of these states actually locked down. And so yet in December, on the December 4th update, there was an expectation that even more states would lock down very soon. And yet here's the update that just happened December 10th. And this is amazing news. You see that from December 4th to December 10th, there's now an expectation that if the rest of the country follows the same pattern as the Midwest, that we won't have to shut down nearly as many states. And so this was very unexpected, and so this was revised. I don't know how much how valid this data is in terms of the new model. And so the reason is when we look over here, oops. And so this is one way of looking at the R value, the current R value. And so one thing that's interesting is when you look at some of the states in the Midwest, like let's take South Dakota or North Dakota. So here's North Dakota. This is hiding my view. All right, so here's North Dakota. You'll notice that the R naught. So before anyone did anything to stop the virus, this was back in March, so March 3rd, March 4th. The R naught, before anyone was wearing masks, before there was physical distancing, before there was any shutdown, was around 1.7 in North Dakota. And so they haven't been great at wearing masks and physically distancing. They did get it after the first shutdown. They did get the R lower, but then they weren't very good at keeping it low. Over the summer, they went back and forth between being better and worse. And so there was a persistent rise over time. But then over the last few weeks, there's been a decrease in the R value, which means that the amounts are decreasing. And that's what we're seeing across the Midwest generally. So for instance, when you compare South Dakota, which also was doing really poorly, their R value has also come below 1, which means that it's decreasing. But again, back in March, their R value was only 2, roughly 2.0. So in contrast, when you look at New York are not. So New York, which got hit really hard, their R naught was 5.23, estimated to be 5.23. And so that's one of the reasons that it just exploded in New York to a much greater extent, because it was just much easier to spread in New York. It was just a more densely populated communities. People were used to going on the trains and the metro, and so it was much easier to spread. New Jersey, similarly, here's New Jersey. The R value was approximately 4.0. And so it was much easier to spread. The problem with an R not being so high is you have to be much, much more effective in wearing masks and and much more rigorous in wearing masks and physically distancing and all these other things in order to bring the R value down. So South Dakota, North Dakota could be pretty bad at adhering to the rules and doing what we know they should be doing, and still be pretty okay. Because if they go down from, let's say, 1.7 down and cut that in half, then that's roughly, what is that, a little bit over 0.8, between 0.8 and 0.9. And that's good, because that's enough to bring it down. That's what you see, 0.9, so it's roughly half. Whereas New York, if they do it in half, then New York is still 5.2. So let's say 5 divided by 2 is still 2.5. So there's still an exponential growth, even if they are 50% effective. And so in some ways, it's easier for the Midwest to get it under control than it was for other parts of the country that saw more explosive growth. Similarly, Ohio. Ohio was a higher R, 2.8, not nearly as high as the Northeast, but it's Midwest, it was still high. And you see that Ohio still is not in the green. Ohio is still growing in terms of the epidemic. So I think that what the IHME did in terms of their latest update is they, I think, may have overreacted a little bit too much to seeing the results that we saw here with the decrease. Because I think that what we're about to see is Ohio and some of the other Midwest states are about to come up. But I think that the effect that we're seeing here is a real effect. I just don't know how replicable it will be in the Northeast, the South, or the West. And so another way of saying this is this peak that we're seeing is that the hypothesis now is that that IHME is using is that this peak will be the same peak that we can expect in the Northeast, the South, and the West, and that there's just sort of this natural peak that we'll reach, and it's been revealed here. But I don't know how much that we can trust that again, because the Northeast and some of these other places had higher R naughts. And so the problem is that now that we're in the flu, pneumonia, and COVID season, it's just going to be much easier to spread it. And it's very hard to keep it under control. This peak is only relative to the amount of precautions that people are taking. So for instance, right now, if you look at, let me go back over here. So this is a picture of mask wearing. This is the proportion of people that report always wearing a mask when they leave. And when you look at the Midwest, it's not as compliant as in other parts of the country. So for instance, the West and the Northeast, but it is fairly compliant. So I mean, this area up here, over 70% of the people living up here report that they wear masks whenever they leave the house. And in this area, it's close to, it looks like 65 to 70% report always wearing a mask. So that means that the peaks that we're seeing are only the peaks as long as these conditions hold. And so as soon as they think that they're out of the woods, if they stop wearing the masks as much, then that means that it's going to start to rise again. And so we might see, depending on the behavior for Christmas and New Year's, we might actually see that it's not a real peak, that it continues to actually rise again after that. But so right now, this is great news, but I don't know how much we can bank on it for the rest of the season. When you look at what the impact is on the forecasts, So this is the new forecasts. Let me go to this one. No, I'm going to go to this one. So this is December 10th. Back in December 4th, we thought that we would be hitting, so the most likely one that they said was that by April, we'd be hitting over 500,000 deaths. We're a little bit lower than that, so close to like 530,000 or so. We're a little bit closer to that. We're a little bit lower than that now. So now the most likely, even with the vaccines and that, is that it's going to be below 500,000. Again, I've said previously, and it's the case still, that these are reported COVID-19 deaths, and we know that the actual number of excess deaths far surpasses the number of reported COVID-19 deaths. Some of it is because of misclassification, and so they're really COVID-19 deaths, but they were misclassified. I think quite a lot of them are misclassified, but then there are also indirect deaths. So, for instance, someone who has a heart attack and they're afraid of going to the hospital because of COVID-19, they could have potentially had their life saved if they hadn't hesitated to go to the hospital, but because they hesitated, they died of a heart attack, unrelated to the infection itself, but indirectly related because of their decision not to go. And there's a bunch of other scenarios in which people make different decisions or have different burdens or different stress, and that impacts their mortality. But so now going here, what's the most likely based on these numbers? So the worst case scenario that they're looking at, let me go, it's more interesting, I think, to look at it as daily deaths. Worst case scenario is that we will exceed 3,000 cases or deaths per day from COVID-19 sometime in January, and potentially hit over 33,500 by February or so, end of January, February. The most likely scenario, though, is not that. Most likely is that we will see 2,500. All right, can you put yourself back on mute, please? And so the most likely scenario is that we will go to 2,500. Now, the thing is, when you look at the total number of deaths that we were just looking at here, where was this? Yeah, here, total number of deaths. So we're already at just about 2,500. We've already been above 2,000 for a while. Here we've hit multiple days with over 3,000 already. But really the most important thing is to look at the average, because when you dig into this, let me look at the deaths. It's a little bit more clear. So when you dig into this, you can see that there's a lot of days, like typically the weekends, where there's not reporting going on. And so you can't really look at any one day. Instead, it's more meaningful to look at the average or the daily average over that week. And so right now, as of yesterday, December 12th, the daily average for the last week was approximately 2,379 deaths, not including the excess deaths that I previously just mentioned. And so when we look at this, so this is 2,379, roughly the middle of December. So when you look at this here, roughly the middle of December, you see that in reality, we're much closer to the 2,500 mark than this model is predicting. In which case, and that's also not including the excess deaths, in which case the December 10th update, I think, is maybe a little bit, gets a little bit wrong, and that they're underestimating what the true impact is going to be. When you compare the December 10th model and daily deaths to the model that they had back in October, that's an interesting exercise as a validation exercise to see, okay, now that we're in the middle of December, what did they predict back in October, and how close are we to it? So let me make this a little bit bigger. Oops. All right, so you can see that back in October, they predicted that in December, there would be under the rational case, which is they were expecting more shutdowns, that we would be having around almost 2,000 per day, 2,000 deaths per day by the middle of December. And their worst case scenario was that we'd be at approximately 2,500 deaths per day by the middle of December. Unfortunately, so 2,500 by the middle of December. Unfortunately, when you look at the real world data, like that I just showed you, we are very close to the worst case scenario that they predicted in October. And so when you look here, back at where we are, I think that in some ways this is more accurate, the more up to date data. But like I say, because we were on the worst case scenario trajectory earlier on, is what we ended up realizing. It wouldn't surprise me if we end up somewhere between worst case and the middle. The green one is if they expect people to shut down, or rather states to shut down, because in reality, we aren't seeing many shutdowns right now. Here's the latest shutdowns. This is businesses shutting down. So here's the latest shutdowns. California has stay-at-home orders. Ohio has some stay-at-home orders. There's some advisories, but the majority of the country, the majority of the states are not shutting down, even though they should be based on the number of deaths assumed in the model. And so as a result, these are the ones that are predicted. These states are the ones that are predicted to shut down in December, and a lot of these aren't shutting down, which means that because they're not shutting down, we're continuing to be on the worst case scenario trajectory of deaths. Like I said, we're going to peak earlier, as you can see here. We're going to peak earlier because we're starting to see the Midwest start to peak. I don't know how far up it's going to go. The vaccines, so the Pfizer vaccine was granted emergency use authorization this week, or this past week. The other one is the Moderna is probably going to get the emergency use authorization this coming week, and so the vaccines are starting to roll out already, and are going to be available for frontline healthcare workers probably first, and within the next week or so, we will hear news of people being vaccinated. All right, so this is the United States. Let me just look at US or at global briefly, and then we can go into the questions. So here is the United States. You can see when we look at the 7-day average, I just smoothed it out a little bit. The United States, we didn't learn our lesson from earlier in the year, and we're on a bad trajectory because we're choosing not to shut down. Europe has shut down. Asia, Africa, Australia, they've had it much under a much better control throughout the year, and in particular the current surge. And so the United States is really in a class of its own, and how poorly that we're doing. This is daily COVID cases. Europe got hit really hard by deaths, and so we're comparable with Europe with deaths. But you see that Europe as a whole reached its peak and is now on its way down, whereas United States as a whole. So I mentioned the Midwest hit its peak, but United States as a whole is not anywhere near its peak. We're not going to peak for a while. In terms of here, what I was showing, we're estimated not to peak in terms of cumulative deaths, which is what we were just looking at. Well, no, that was daily deaths. We're estimated not to peak for daily deaths until sometime in February. And so this. Oh no, actually, this one. Like maybe end of January, early February is what we're looking at for us to peak. So there's going to be a lot of excess deaths that didn't need to happen, but it was simply because of the way it's been managed by the government. All right, in terms of, so that's global at a high level. I'm not going to spend too much time actually on this week. We can go into, if there's other questions, we can go into it. But so for now, let's go to questions, because there were a bunch of really interesting questions this week. All right, Arlene, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. That was very interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, being that you mentioned the vaccines, can you tell us the latest about the vaccines? What are the ingredients in the mRNA vaccines? And are there any preservatives or anything to be worried about?
Sure. So let me find where I put that together. All right, so here it is. So this is the full list of ingredients in the Pfizer mRNA vaccines that were just approved for emergency use given emergency use authorization. This is what the FDA has reported is publicly, so it's completely transparent. I'll go through everything in detail just so everyone knows. There are no preservatives in the vaccine. So the anti-vaxxers for other types of vaccines were very concerned about this molecule, thimerosal, which is a organic mercury compound. There's not any reason to be worried about thimerosal scientifically, but because there was concern, it's being phased out across many vaccines, but there's none in this vaccine in particular. So no one needs to worry about it. Here are the full list of ingredients. The active ingredient, of course, is the sliver of RNA from the virus. So that encodes the S protein, the spike protein. In addition, there's these fats. The fats are included, and there's 4 different kinds of fats that they use because it makes essentially a bubble around the RNA and protects the RNA. And then when it's injected into the body, then because our cells are made out of phospholipids, they're fatty, then the fatty portion enables it to be absorbed into the cells to an easier extent. There's salts that are included. Potassium chloride is sea salts, sodium chloride is table salt, just regular salts that are included just to have it have stability and to maintain the pH. I'll go into them a little bit more detail, but then the final thing that's in there is just regular table sugar, the same sugar that you use in baking. It's called sucrose is the chemical name for it. It's just regular sugar. And so these ingredients are nothing to be worried about. Let me dig in a little bit. So Pfizer keeps on making this point. There's no preservatives, nothing for anti-vaxxers to be worried about. I'm going to go past this. There's no preservatives. Next is the lipids. So there's one lipid that could cause some side effect, and that's the first one that was on the list. Its nickname is ALC 3015. Again, these are there for stability and to protect the RNA. But apparently that fat, this fat can cause some reactions in some people, and so it's still something that's being investigated. But that's something we'll get into in a second. But it's not any major thing to worry about. Next are the salts. The salts are primarily added for the pH, just to make sure it doesn't become too acidic or not acidic enough. Because the whole point is that it needs to keep the acidity level that's in our blood, so it matches exactly or very closely the pH level in our blood. And then finally, the saline solution. So this is concentrated when it's distributed, and then it needs to be diluted to give to individual patients. And so this is the saline solution that's used, and all that means is just salt water that's mixed with the vaccine. And then sugar, you might ask, why are they adding sugar to an injection? Well, the reason is because that it's just regular sugar, because it helps to protect the nanoparticles when they're frozen, and it stops them from sticking together. So it's all just like these are food ingredients essentially that they're using, and I think probably that was part of their thinking in terms of what they actually used, just because they knew people would be looking at the ingredient list, and so the closer they could use food ingredients as part of what they were actually using as the ingredients, the better it would be, the more readily adapted it would be. So the ingredients are really good. All right, next question. Did I answer all of those questions, or what was the next one?
Well, I was going to ask you about other side effects, but it sounds like you've pretty much gone into that.
No. Let me. So I can dig into the side effects. Here are some of the major side effects.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So, yeah, for sure. So actually, the side effect profile. This is a little hard to read, so I'll make it a little bigger. But it's interesting. The high side effect profile is different for people over the age of 55 versus under the age of 55. So let me just flip back and forth. You can see that people over the age of 55 tend to have less symptoms, less side effects than people under the age of 55. And so I'm not exactly sure why that is. I'll flip back and forth again for a second. All right, but so let me start with the ones under the age of 55. So what we see here on the top are the different types of symptoms that they looked at that were reported. One is fever, then fatigue. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. All right, let me make it that big. Okay, so fever, these are the ones listed: fever, fatigue, headache, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, and joint pain. Nothing more serious than this was identified in all these people that they had in their studies. That many tens of thousands of people, nothing more serious than this was identified. And so within these, they compared the people who got the vaccine, the people, that's what this long string of letters are, BNT162B2, was the people who got the vaccine, and then the placebo is always compared. So for instance, here what we're looking at is that when they're looking at fever, the top one is and the other thing is the top one is the people who got the first dose, and then the bottom one is the reactions for the second dose. So one of the first things that you see is among people who had any side effect from the injection, the first dose typically had a smaller side effect, and the second dose, after they had some immunogenicity, after some reaction, immune reaction, rather, they had a bigger. You could see that the vaccine had been effective, and so they were having an immune response, and the immune response is what was causing these symptoms. So, but the interesting thing is, so there's a couple of things to call out. First, if you look at fatigue definitely clearly in the 16 to 55 group was the most common symptom among people who had the vaccine. And approximately 50%, not quite 50% of the people reported having fatigue. However, when you compare that to the placebo group, so they had, remember, placebo is nothing. It's just an injection with like saline water, nothing in it that has no reaction, should have no reaction. People, when they thought they were getting the vaccine, almost, so what is this, like 35% of the people reported that they had fatigue. So in terms of how much fatigue people actually get when you compare it to placebo, it's not very much more. So it means that it likely is very safe. But in terms of the perceived effect among people that we can expect once we give them the vaccination, there's not going to be any placebo. It's going to be the real thing. And so we can expect that fatigue is going to be a very common symptom that people report. Headache also. The headaches tend to be, the green is very, very mild. Let me see if I can bring this up a little bit. All right, so green is very mild, yellow is moderate, red is severe, and then something serious would be purple. We don't see any purple. The symptoms, when we see them, they don't last very long. Let me make this bigger again. So typically they last less than 24 hours. Some people might have lasted a little bit more than 24 hours, but almost all of these people reported that they were gone within 24 hours. So we see headache. Here's chills some people had. Vomiting, one person in placebo, one person in the vaccine, each reported vomiting. In terms of muscle pain, there was a little bit of muscle pain early on, a little bit of joint pain. Diarrhea, you can see diarrhea does not seem to be a side effect when you compare it to the placebo, because there were exactly roughly the same number of people in the placebo versus the vaccine that reported that symptom. So it's not likely to be something that we'll see to a greater extent. However, because people, when they actually get the vaccine, they won't know that it's in their mind. It's a psychosomatic thing that's causing it, or other reasons. It's just a common symptom in the population for other reasons, that they might attribute it to the vaccine because they won't know. Similarly, when you look at the second dose, there were a lot more symptoms. So at the second dose, approximately 60% of the people reported fatigue. Approximately 55% reported headache. And not only that, they reported more intense fatigue and more intense headache and chills. But again, this wasn't grade 4. It wasn't really, really bad. And it all subsided. If they took Tylenol or Advil or whatever, it went away. And so it was very easily treated. It's nothing to be worried about. Just pretty typical for similar, I guess, in many ways to when people get a flu vaccine or whatnot in terms of what you can expect. So yeah, that's it. I can go back to the over 55 group. You can see that the symptoms were a lot less, like I said, than for the under 55 group, with the exception of the second dose. It wasn't quite as bad as the under 55 group, but the second dose, once people develop an immune response, then you would expect more severe symptoms because your immune system is reacting to it. At the first dose, you don't really have any antibodies or anything to react to. And so as a result, you don't really expect many symptoms except injection site stuff. Whereas with the second dose, your body's had a chance to react. And so as a result, you can see an impact. All right. In terms of fever, I'm not going to go into much more detail there. But yeah, these are the major symptoms that we were looking at nothing is concerning me, and it's within 24 hours. It's mostly gone. The second dose is really going to be important. I don't know if I put a graphic here. No, I didn't put the graphic. Let me see if I can find it real quickly. Give me 1 second. All right. Let's see. Do I see it? Here it is. All right. So this is an interesting slide. This was reported by the FDA when they were granting the emergency use authorization. What we're looking at here is the cumulative new cases of SARS-CoV-2 infection of COVID-19. They were looking at symptoms, so we can call it COVID-19. This was the cumulative. So the red is the placebo group. These were people who got no vaccine, and you can see that it was pretty consistent number of new infections over time. And then this was the vaccinated group in terms of their COVID-19. So you can see that there was huge protection, 95% protection. This is what had been reported previously. But the interesting thing is this part right here. And so this is the first dose. The first dose is given at day 0. And interestingly is that there's an early signal that by approximately day 14 is when the protection starts. So at that first dose, there's no protection for that first week or two after that first dose, because it takes a while for the immune system to kick in after the vaccine is given. But after approximately 2 weeks, you start seeing this protection. And then the booster shot is given, I think, at approximately 20 days, 30 days or so. You'll find out more details when you receive the vaccine. But you see then that gives this persistent vaccine effect, protective effect. We don't know yet. There's a lot we still don't know. For instance, how long will this protect us into the future? We don't know if people are still contagious. The early indications so far that I saw, some of the very early data that I saw reported, I haven't seen all the data, is that people do seem to have a lower viral load among if they had the vaccine, which means that they might have less viral shedding, and so therefore it might be less contagious. But we don't know for sure yet. And so if we find, because these people who are in the vaccine trials are going to be followed for months or maybe years, then we'll know when their protection starts to wane. And then we'll know, okay, if it starts to wane in 6 months or a year, then that will be a time that we'll probably need another booster shot. So we'll know these people got their first doses months ago already. And so we'll have a long window in which we'll know what to be looking out for among people who get vaccinated in the coming weeks and months. All right, Arlene, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Glenn. All right, how much vaccine coverage do we expect there to be around the globe?
Yeah, this was an interesting piece that I just saw in Bloomberg, and they were looking at this idea. Let me make it a little bit bigger. They were looking at this idea of how much vaccine has been purchased by various countries. Interestingly, Canada is, I think, the global leader right now. They purchased approximately 4 times more vaccine than they need for their country. And there's 2 reasons for this. One reason is that we didn't know ahead of time when we made the deals to purchase it, which vaccines would be most effective or how frequently they would need to be given out. And so because of this, a lot of countries tried to get more than they might need, because you didn't know, is the Pfizer vaccine going to be effective? Is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the Sanofi? And so because of this, they invested a little bit in a lot of different vaccines. And so that's one of the reasons why there was a lot more. The early indications are now that if the S antigen is so effective with the mRNA vaccine, I think it's the AstraZeneca has reported early results that theirs is approximately 70% effective so far. Then the vaccines are probably going to be consistently effective. I haven't seen anything as high as the mRNA vaccines yet, though. But so you can see different countries. Europe really invested a lot, in the United Kingdom invested a lot in terms of getting their vaccine coverage up there. And so Europe is also ahead of the United States. We had this idea that it was with our current president that it would be America first, and that the strategy in America was that they would invest heavily in the vaccines. But in reality, the European Union invested more heavily than the United States did. and ensuring that they got more vaccine coverage. Canada invested more. The other thing is, if we get more vaccine than we need, then we'll have a surplus, and the surplus can either be used that we'll have the stock on hand if we need to have booster shots in another 6 months or a year, so we'll have that in hand already, or depending on the persistence, we'll have vaccine available that we can then donate to other countries to prevent SARS-CoV-2 there. In addition to the humanitarian reason to give SARS-CoV-2 vaccines broadly around the globe, there's also a personal reason for the United States and for other countries. And that is, right now, the vaccine is made for the commonly circulating strains of SARS-CoV-2. The problem is, if SARS-CoV-2 continues to circulate in, say, South America or other areas that were hit hard, then it could mutate. And if it mutates, then it could break through our vaccine barriers, and we need to develop new vaccines. So it's really, really important that we get vaccine coverage all across the globe for the current strains. Because the more strains, the mutations, like I've mentioned in previous weeks, are like throwing dice. The more opportunities for a mutation that you have, the more the increased risk is over time. And if you can reduce the number of infections around the globe, then you dramatically reduce the opportunity for new mutations. And so our vaccine should work long-term as a result of that. So it's really, really important that we not only vaccinate ourselves in Europe, the United States, Canada, and these other countries that have purchased enough, but that we really ensure that the rest of the world has vaccine coverage as well. And right now, much of the world does not have the coverage that we need.
Wow. That sounds very, next question, that sounds very important. Okay, there's a rumor that the COVID-19 vaccines can cause infertility. Is there any truth to these rumors?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. No, not yeah, there's truth. It's a very interesting question. There is no truth to it. So let me get to it. Where was it? All right, here is, I can go into some of the weeds. So this is one of the things, it was a rumor out there. So someone said, so let me describe, so this S protein is the spike protein for the coronavirus, is what the vaccines are all focusing on, because we want it to develop neutralizing antibodies, and so we want to focus on the S protein. And the problem is that the S protein does share a little bit of overlap in terms of the way it looks, in terms of its sequence, how it looks to a protein that is found in the placenta. And so the protein, this Syncytin, is found in the placenta. It's part of this, the cellular structure is part of the placenta. And so the worry that some physician had said was that, oh, well, because this protein is found in the placenta, then the worry is that if we develop these vaccines, then people might develop antibodies to the placenta. And it's not the case. I've had a really great review by this guy, Dr. Edward Nierenberg. The link is down below. But essentially, here's the key takeaway. So SARS-CoV-2, the S protein, if you remember, the vaccine is only just a tiny, tiny sliver of the actual SARS-CoV-2 virus. So if there, so people who are actually getting infected, all the many tens of millions of people who have been infected around the world have developed antibodies to the exact antibody that the vaccine is replicating, one of the antibodies. So typically, as I mentioned previously, people who are naturally infected develop antibodies to many different things, not just the S protein, but also the N protein and other proteins as part of the virus. But they do develop the S protein. And so that means if there were problems with the placenta, where the people, women who were infected with SARS, who had antibodies to the S antigen, so these S antibodies, if there was a problem, we would have started seeing it among the many millions of women of childbearing age who were getting pregnant and maybe were asymptomatic or whatnot over the last 9 months. And what you find is that we don't see any evidence at all among people who actually were infected with coronavirus. You don't see any change in first trimester spontaneous abortions or in miscarriage rates early in the pregnancy. There's no change that we see, which means if that means the antibodies that people are producing for the same S protein from the virus, if that's not causing antibodies against the placenta, then that means there's no reason to predict that the vaccine would have any reason to cause antibodies against the placenta. But even more interesting is that when you look at there's a program online, a website where you can compare sequences, so the specific recipe for the RNA for the vaccine to the or rather to the protein rather, when you compare that to the placenta protein, you can look to see if there's any overlap, not just with the placenta protein, but any protein at all in the human body that there could be cross reactivity to that you might be afraid of. And when you search, and so there's this tool called the Basic Local Alignment Search Tool BLAST. This looks to see if there's any similarity between the protein, the S protein, versus any other protein in the human body. When you do the search, you can see the results here. No significant similarity found. There's 0 results. So this is great news. Nothing to be worried about in women. The one thing that people are looking at, so there's a couple of things that I haven't looked at very closely for this week. One is we didn't know early on in the year whether there would be a baby boom from COVID-19 because people were shut in their houses back in March, April, May. So would there be a baby boom? Or would there be a baby bust where people were having less kids because they were terrified with the epidemic that they were losing their jobs, they had income insecurity, they were worried about what the next year or two would look like, and so there was a worry that there'd be a baby bust instead of a baby boom. And so right now it's still a little bit clear. So March was approximately 9 months from where we are now, not quite. So we're beginning to enter the window when we should have a very clear signal on whether there was a baby boom or not. Right now, as far as I can tell, we're not seeing a baby boom, and it seems like there's more likely to be a baby bust. But the question is whether it's infertility or people simply making a choice. And definitely in the surveys that I've seen so far, a lot of women are terrified, or back in March or April, were terrified of having kids at that point because they were worried about income and the epidemic, that we didn't know how long it would last. So right now, I would not consider infertility. The only one other thing that some people are looking at is, so we do know that the ACE2 receptor is found in testicles, male testicles. And we do know now that SARS-CoV-2 has been demonstrated to infect male testicles. And so we don't know what the long-term effects are of that. One of the consequences of the infection in the testicles is that among some men, particularly the ones who have the most severe symptoms, their testosterone levels do decrease a little bit. And that may be related to the infection in the male testicles where the testosterone is produced. And so we don't know what that might look like for infertility yet. And that might be something that we might need to look at going on. But so far, there's no cause for concern because, like I say, when you look at, so generally among people who did get pregnant, there was no change in miscarriage rates or spontaneous abortions in the first trimester or second trimester. So far, there's nothing to be worried about. And so yeah, this is good news.
Okay, well, this next question is related to this. And the question that was sent in says, can the COVID-19 vaccine prevent erectile dysfunction?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. And so it's most likely to, the question here I put was most likely to prevent erectile dysfunction. So yeah, let me say it again. The COVID-19 vaccine is extremely likely to prevent erectile dysfunction. The reason is that COVID-19 seems very likely to cause erectile dysfunction. And there's a few reasons why that are hypothesized. The reasons are, so people who have a severe episode, they have severe symptoms, if they end up in the intensive care unit, maybe they have heart attacks or strokes or other cardiovascular issues. Maybe they have a blood clot that forms. These are all consequences of the SARS-CoV-2 infection, of COVID-19. And so the problem is that all of those things puts a person at much, much higher risk for erectile dysfunction long term. So this idea, it's called the microthrombosis. So these very, very tiny blood clots that might form in the capillaries, might cause transient ischemic attacks, and but they're very, very micro, very small. These could be related to erectile dysfunction in terms of seeing a bigger increase of erectile dysfunction in people. And so this is something that a lot of scientists are worried about, and that we're tracking erectile dysfunction in people who have had symptomatic or even asymptomatic COVID-19 over time. And so the risk factors for erectile dysfunction are likely to that there's still the risk factors, and COVID-19 only makes those even worse. So because of that, there's a huge expectation that if the vaccine prevents SARS-CoV-2 and prevents COVID-19, then to the degree it prevents COVID-19 in the population, that's the degree that it'll prevent erectile dysfunction. So this is another reason to get vaccinated with COVID-19. It prevents erectile dysfunction. This is science. This is true. So people should be, if there's anyone that is hesitant to get a vaccine, you tell them this, that it prevents erectile dysfunction. Way, way better to get COVID-19 vaccine than risk exposure in the natural virus.
I'm sure there are many that are happy to hear that information. Okay, the next question is, are there any updates to T cells? Are people who are suspected of having T cell activation protected from the SARS-CoV-2?
Yes, so that's an interesting question. Earlier on in the year, there were some really intriguing studies. So if you recall, there's the two main ways that the body responds, that the immune system responds to a viral attack are, pardon me, one is through an antibody, which directly attacks the virus itself. And then the other way are these T cells. And the T cells, instead of directly attacking the virus, it attacks a whole cell. So if they find that there's a cell that's been infected with many, many viruses, with many copies of the virus, then the T cells attack the whole cell and then just eat the whole cell, so that take it out of the body. And so T cells are really important. What they found is that a lot of people, in fact, roughly a third of people that they tested had T cells that recognized SARS-CoV-2 in the lab, in the petri dishes. And this was amazing. So we thought, wow, if all of these people had T cells already to protect them from SARS-CoV-2, maybe that would reduce herd immunity, and it would make it much less likely that it would not be as bad as we feared in terms of the COVID-19 epidemic. And so this was an area of optimism, but uncertainty. We didn't know what would actually happen when you looked at real world data. And the problem, so now we've looked at real world data, and what they've done is they've looked at past infection to seasonal coronaviruses. So this is where the T cells would have come from, is past exposure to coronaviruses that just caused the common cold. Then they looked at people who had previously gotten seasonal coronaviruses and looked to see if it decreased the risk of infection or decreased the risk of severity of disease with SARS-CoV-2. And what they found is that it had no effect on either. So people who were previously infected with the seasonal, the mild coronaviruses that no one had ever even really talked about much in the public before SARS-CoV-2, being infected with the seasonal cold viruses, with the coronaviruses, it did not protect, did not have immunity for protect against infection, and it didn't. And among people who were infected, it did not make them less likely to have severe disease. So there was some maybe hint, if you increase the trial size. Pardon me. All this talking makes my throat dry. So there was some perhaps, but there was no statistical significance. So there's no evidence right now that there's any difference at all. in severity. So that means that this early hypothesis that we had earlier in the year, that this T cell cross reactivity in the petri dish might prove that it was effective in the real world, turns out not to be the case. So, but oh well.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much for that, Glenn. Okay, are there any updates on the best masks to wear or the best ways to wear them?
Yeah, so there was actually an interesting study that was done recently, looking at the different masks to see. There was one that we talked about a month or two ago that was done at Duke Medical School. This one was done at UNC Chapel Hill. And so this was looking at different masks, but not only looking at the different masks, looking at things we could do to the masks that might make them more useful. So for instance, most people wear a mask like on the left, just the way that you see on the upper left. But what if you were to cross the band to make it a little bit more tighter? Or if you were to put something in the back, a neck, what are they calling it? A neck guard or ear guard that you would pull it back, the mask tighter against your face to make it so that less air escaped. Or what if you were to put a hair clip? A lot of women have these hair clips. Use that. They also tried using a rubber band, and then finally a silk stocking or nylon hosiery to see, okay, well, that would tightly put it against the face. And so it's interesting. They looked at all these comparisons. Let me show you now what the results were. All right, so first off, let me bring this to the top. All right, so first off, they found that the things that tended to work the least well were just the regular, let me do this one. So as we know, we've talked about previously, the bandanas tended to be really poor. Even if you cross the bandana over and double it over, like you see here and this one over here, they still only are around 50% effective. The gaiters, these things are that a lot of runners use and athletes use. This is only around 38% effective. So not great. The 38% effectiveness is very similar to this one here, which is another common mask, which is the single layer woven like polyester nylon mask. And so both of these are not that great, way better than nothing. The 3-layer woven cotton mask that you might see a lot is even worse. This one is only 26%, 27% effective. And so you see that some are not very good. The ones that tended to be better, so among these, none of these really work amazingly well. The better ones are the surgical masks or the ones that are meant for this kind of thing if you can get it. But then the question is, well, does doing any of this stuff help? And so when you look here, this is the procedure mask with ear loops. The procedure, one other thing that was interesting before I go on there was, where can I see if I can find it? All right, so the 2-layer woven, let me come back to this one. The 2-layer woven nylon mask with ear loops. So that's this one, just a standard 2-layer woven nylon mask with ear loops. They found on its own, without any aluminum bridge, most people don't wear it with an aluminum bridge. Without, it was around 44%. So roughly the same. It was roughly the same to wear this as it was to wear the gaiter. But what they found, so if you could do things to increase the effectiveness for all of these. So there's these nose bridges that sort of seal the distance between your cheekbone and your nose, and so it prevents air from escaping. A lot of us know who wear glasses, if you're not wearing your mask right, then if you wear the mask, your glasses might fog up. And what that means is that all these aerosols are escaping because your glass is fogging up. So it's all escaping right in the area by your glasses. So if you can, and so they sell these things called these nose bridges. You can get it from Amazon.com that you put under the mask and it makes a tighter seal. And when they do this, it actually increases the effectiveness. It goes from 44%, 45% effective all the way to 56% effective. And another thing that they could do is if they have the aluminum nose bridge and then sort of buy an additional filter to put in under the mask, then that increases it all the way up to 79% effective. And so these things are really interesting. Oh, no, I'm sorry. One more, that increased it to 74% effective. But here is a fascinating finding. If so, all of these were based on a non-washed mask. And a lot of us had assumed that if you washed a mask, it would make it less effective because maybe it wasn't as tightly woven as you might have had before. But what they found was that even with no nose bridge or anything else, if you washed the regular nylon mask, and it's probably not too different from some of these other masks, but the only one they studied here and reported on was the nylon mask. If you washed this mask, it went from being 45% effective to being 79% effective. Washing the mask, maybe it disintegrated some of the fibers a little bit and made them spread out a little bit more and made it so it was, instead of being 45% effective, made it 79% effective. So in that case, this simply washing the mask might be a really, really important thing. This is right now, it's just one small study, so it's unclear to take away anything away from it, but it's really interesting that doing that could help. But then if we come back over here to these adjustments that people made in the masks. So now, so here is the reference. Again, just using some of these. This was around 45%. This was 38%. So it was all like 38 to 45% or so. Some of these being a little bit less. The 3-layer woven was this one. This one was a little bit less. You see that the reason being that the fit wasn't very good. You can see down here a lot of air can easily escape, whereas over here they're a little bit tighter and less air can escape. Less air can escape here. That's the reason why not quite as effective. But here, what you find is that when you tuck the, so here we're looking at the procedure mask with ear loops, the regular one. This one on its own is only 38% effective. So 38% effective. And again, the reason why, so 38% effective here is identical to the 38% effective with the gator. And the reason is all the air escaping from the sides. Most people wear one of these masks and don't realize how much air is escaping from the sides. The aerosols can get on that you might notice if you wear glasses, but if you don't wear glasses, you might not even know. And so the question is, how do you make it improve from 38% to a higher amount? So what they found was that if they cross the loops, then and tied in the corners, you see right now the corners are sticking out, but if they tie it in, then it goes from 38% to 60%. And if you put in this ear guard, it also is up at 62%, so roughly the same. If you use a hair clip, it's at 65%. So simply wearing a mask, but instead of putting the loops behind your ear, using a hair clip in the back raises it from 38%, 39%, raises it all the way to 65% effective. If you fix the mask with rubber bands, so I don't know if you can see this, but looks very painful actually. In fact, they even reported in the study. Look at his ears. Let's move this over. So you can see his ears here were not that painful, but you see with the rubber bands, his ear is all bent, and you can't wear that way for very long because it would be very painful. But for that time, it increased it from 38% with nothing. By using the rubber bands, it increased it all the way up to 78%. So that's a big difference, 38% to 78%. Again, the major reason is people are losing air around the sides because hardly anyone I see wears these masks very tightly. The other thing that's more comfortable, although it doesn't look very comfortable, frankly, but it's more comfortable than the rubber bands, is using the nylon hosiery. And so that just makes the mask go against your face. The problem with this one, for anyone who's now worn the mask over the last 6 months or however long we've been wearing it, is that it gives you like a suffocating feeling. I don't know if anyone else has noticed. The way around the suffocating feeling are these mask brackets. You can also get this on Amazon.com. And so it's sort of as a bracket that you put under the mask. It lifts it away from your face. And then if you were to put this this hosiery on top of that, then it would presumably seal your face really well. And so probably that would be the best combination. One of these masks, the surgical mask, if you can get your hands on it, with the nylon hosiery sleeve over it, so it's very tight. But make sure you put the mask bracket inside so you don't have that suffocating feeling, so you can still breathe regularly, but you don't have any air escaping around the sides. So anyway, that answer. Any questions about that? I think that answers that question.
No, I think that did. Thank you very much, Glenn. All right, we're running out of time, so we're going to ask one more question. And this in particularly I'm interested in because I drove somebody just this week. It says, if you're driving in a car with other people, what is the best combination of windows to open to be the safest?
Yeah, so I can imagine a lot of people have this question because we're still traveling either to bring kids to school or for other reasons. And we sometimes are forced to share cars with other people who might have been infected. And so there was a study looking at which windows to open, assuming that you had the fan on. So all of these assume that the fan or air conditioner or heater in the car would be at full blast running. What additional windows would you want to open, even with the air conditioning heater or whatever blowing full force? And so the case number 1 was everything was closed. Case number 6 was all the windows were open, and then the 2 through 5 were everything in between. The case number 2 was that the rear left and the front right were open, so you would sort of have cross ventilation. And then the case 3 was the front left, so the driver's side window and the rear right would be open, so you would have cross ventilation that way. And then finally, case 4 was only the driver's side window was open. In case 5, only the rear right window was open for a passenger. All right, you can see on this graph how much airflow there was. So clearly having all the windows open really did make a huge difference versus having no windows open. So remember, all of these situations assume that the fan was on full blast, that the heat was on or the air conditioner, wherever people are in the country, that even having the windows open made a huge difference. But in particular, they showed what the impact is of the different scenarios. So you can see that it's actually a much bigger difference. If a driver is infected, whether it's asymptomatic or not, they don't have to know that they're infected. But if the driver is infected and you want to see what's the risk to the passenger, then the red is bad. The less red you see, the more white you see, the better. And so remember, scenario 6 was all the windows open. All the windows being open makes an enormous difference. You can see there's virtually no risk with all the windows open and the heat on and the fans on. If a driver is infected and the passenger is sitting behind them, so driver is A, the passenger behind them is B, there's virtually no risk if all the windows are open and the heat's on, a passenger B being infected. So this is great news. It's unclear from this study C or D, but it's likely to be very similar to B in terms of the air, because the airflow would be expected to be similar. In contrast, this example is if the passenger is infected and the risk of infection to the driver. And so here, if the passenger is infected, they're blowing, and the problem is it does accumulate a little bit in the back of the car. And so as a result, it's similar, very similar to what you saw before, but you see that there is a little bit of risk of infection, even with all of the windows open. If a passenger is infected, there still is some movement to a circulation in the car so that the person in the driver's seat can get infected. It still reduces the risk dramatically, but there still is a residual risk there. So better if you are driving with someone who's outside of your bubble, definitely include. I would have people wear if it's winter time and it's very cold, have them dress winter appropriate as if they're standing outside. Put on the hat, put on the jacket, turn the heat up on the car, and open the windows just to be safe.
Okay, that's very, very good, useful information. Thank you so much. And thank you so much tonight, Glenn. Once again, you've been so informative and we all really appreciate it. But it is time to end this course, this session tonight. So we want to thank you again and look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week, 7 o'clock next Sunday evening.
Thank you very much, Arlene, for coming in for Rebecca tonight. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone who's watching this appreciates it as well. Thank you. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.